The Rosenberg case was one of the most famous or infamous in American history. It took place at the height of the Cold War. It was the late 1940s, the end of World War II, and the beginning of the 1950s. We all remember that, as I'm sure, right? It involved a particularly and peculiar, lethal combination of anti-Semitism, which I think a lot of people don't quite get, maybe, fear of communism, which has still been since after World War I. It was the end of World War II. It was the beginning, very slow, very low key, but it was what really was the beginning of the Korean War. Anybody remember that?
Yes.
June 1950 to 1953. It was the apprehension about the atomic bomb, the first of, not the last, the first of the terrible war weapons that had the potential, that we understood at that time, to wipe out all life on the planet. That was kind of scary. And end the world as we knew it. So all these things are swirling around it. In addition, it was gender-linked. We'll talk about that a little bit. That's also just sort of coming in. We start with some people. You're going to have to know some names. Very few. I tried to limit the cast of characters. It really was much more than the few I'm talking about. Ethel Greenglass. She was born in September 1915. Right? Interesting date. In New York, to Russian immigrants, Barnett and Tessie Greenglass. Her father ran a repair shop for sewing machines, but he was barely able to eke out a living on the Lower East Side. So you have to remember, she was born into poverty. She was born into that whole world of Slavic, Eastern European type Judaism. He had a wife, obviously, and he had 4 children. She was the eldest. There were 3 sons after her. The family lived in a driven past where it was, it's long gone happily, a very shabby, unheated tenements. You certainly should remember that if you've ever gone to the tenement museum or seen some of that. And Ethel was the only daughter. As such, they did not spend on a huge amount of education. She went to a religious girls' school on the Lower East Side, which has long since vanished. And then she went to Seward Park High School. Seward Park?
Sure.
Okay. She graduated at 15. She was a highly intelligent girl. She certainly knew Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish at home. She knew Hebrew, English, obviously, I mean, all this kind of stuff. She desperately wanted to go to college, but girls didn't go to college in those days, at least from her economic circumstances. And so at 15, when she graduated, she worked. She went out to work. She became a clerk for a shipping company, import-export, Lower East Side, low level, and she remained at this job for the next 4 years. She didn't earn a huge amount of money, but whatever, she lived at home. Whatever she earned, turned back in, as I'm sure some of you remember, you turn it back to the family because that's what you did, and certainly not living independently. She got fired. And why was she fired? No, better. She had joined the labor union. Right? And we don't have any protections for labor unions at that point. And she was like, okay, 15, 16, 17, 18. She's still a teenager, right? At this point, on the cusp of almost turning 20, she led a strike of 150 women workers. And why did she lead the strike? Because she discovered they were being paid less than the men for almost the same sort of job. They had no protections. There was nothing. They worked crazy hours. The boss could, do any kind of thing that they wanted and nothing. And so she led them all on a walkout, and of course she was fired, and there was no recourse whatsoever. So she then joined. Dates are kind of hazy, but I'm going to say at this time when she was fired, she joined the Young Communist League, eventually becoming a member of the American Communist Party. Now, let's step back. It's the end of World War I. You remember, right? The Russian Revolution, 2 in 1 year. Kerensky took over. Kerensky failed to end the war. His big mistake was staying in the war. There was a second revolution. Lenin gets to St. Petersburg. The Bolsheviks take over. There's this whole horrible type thing, and the Communist Party is founded. And Russia turns communist, as of 1918, 1919, depending on what calendar you're using, okay? And this was the brave new world. Workers of the world, unite, right? Everybody was going to do this. And it came at the same time that there's this huge push for workers' rights. Why are the workers fighting for the capitalists? You have to get your mind back to all of this there. And if you remember your American history, which I hope you do, Eugene D. Debs led the Socialist Party. He was in jail. He ran for president, got a huge amount of votes, the most from jail, because he had spoken against the United States entering into the war. So that's the political, social ferment that brings her into this Communist Party. People felt that the Communists were the wave of the future. They had slaughtered the Russian nobility, they had murdered the Tsar and his family, and that was considered a good thing, although other people were very horrified by it. And by joining the Communist Party, her intent was to help people like this high school graduate young girl who had no protection and was fired for leading a strike to get better conditions. So keeping that in mind with all of this, right? She was active socially. She joined a choir. That was a big activity in those days. And as part of the choir, with all the young people together, she met Julius Rosenberg. He was part of the choir also. That was one of the cultural things that they did. They married in the summer of 1939. Another very fraught year in world history. She stayed home. That's what women did. Work, right? And she raised two sons. Robert was born in 1943. Michael was born in 1947. Later, jumping ahead, both sons will become college professors. Married, and they each had two children. But that's later on. Forget that until we get to the end of the story. Okay. So, Julius Rosenberg, her husband, was born in 1918. Again, wartime upheaval. He was the son of Polish immigrants, the same Eastern European thing. His father, Harry, worked in the garment industry. Remember the terrible conditions there? While his mother raised 5 children on this much wages. He graduated from Seward Park, the same high school she did. They sort of knew each other, but not really. They didn't really meet until the choir thing. And then he went to City College. He went to college because he was a boy. She didn't go to college because she was a girl, right? He graduated in 1939 with a degree in electrical engineering. Now, in those days, of course, everybody. But you have to understand, that was a very important skill and profession. Electricity, people are just beginning to get radios. Remember that? I remember the first radio we had in my family. We listened to the World Series in 1945. So that part of it was, he was in a cutting-edge technology, a cutting-edge profession, where he came into contact with a whole lot of other people. So even though she didn't have a college education, she was certainly his intellectual equal with all of this. When he was at City College, he joined the Young Communist League. He was actively involved in trying to prove the innocence of the Scottsboro boys. Does anybody remember that? Yeah. They were 9 black youths. They were in a railroad car with 2 white women, which was unheard of. And when the railroad car pulled into one of the southern terminals and the car door was open and the 2 white women were there, the railroad employees were horrified that these 2 white women were in the same boxcar as the 9 black men. And it's hard to imagine now, but I want you to cast your mind back. The white railroad employee said, what happened? And the women, to avoid the shame of even being in the car, said, we were raped, we were taken. And so these 9 innocent black men, just trying to get north, to get economic jobs and everything, were accused, put into jail, tried for the rape of 2 white women, which of course never happened. I am reminding you that very recently, almost the same sort of thing happened in New York City, the Central Park Five, right? The jogger Sadly, she was, in fact, very badly mauled, but they did not do it, right? And now, 20, 30 years later, their innocence has been proved beyond a doubt. One of them just got elected to the New York City Council. So this concept of black men attacking white women has long been in American, the world, whatever, that has happened. But the Scottsboro case was one of the first. It was big, it was a lot, there were a lot of kids involved, media was all over it, and so it became a cause célèbre. The only people that defended them were the communists. They paid for their lawyers, they paid for their food, they paid for their families to try and get to them. They kept it alive as an example of, how does one say this, white American horror, racism, degradation of the capitalist system. I mean, say whatever you want to say, but it was a marvelous cause for them and a way for them to recruit other people to the cause and to tarnish the American image. If America was such a democracy, how could you do something like this? I don't know if you can get this into your head, but this was a huge, huge thing to happen. And so the Scottsboro case became Julius's and Ethel's introduction, as if they needed one, to the values of belonging to the Communist Party. Truth, justice, the American way of life, the protection from the Constitution, all this kind of stuff. So if you can grasp that, that gives you maybe sort of an insight into how they came to do what they did. What happened? In 1940, Julius joined, remember, 1940, or almost into the war, he joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps as a civilian engineer. Now, why did he do that? One, because he had the training. Two, it was a steady job, right? He had a wife and family to support, and it gave him sort of status. He's voluntarily, he didn't wait to be drafted. He wouldn't have been because he had kids at that time and he was too old. He voluntarily joins the U.S. Army before we're even in the war in 1940. That will, by the way, be used against him in his trial as, oh, you've already been plotting the war with this, right? He was assigned to a laboratory at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, base, we're just out, you know that. Okay, so in 1942, he began collecting documents, drawings, papers, whatever, and trying to find a contact to turn them over to the Soviet embassy. Why did he do that? Because he felt that communism was the wave of the future. And he also felt that he was helping, perhaps, to share his knowledge with people that he felt were important to his way of life. They had defended the Scottsboro Wars. They were building a new society, a better world, right? A new world. And he began to do this. At the same time, his brother-in-law, Ethel's brother, David Greenwest. David Greenwest had the education that was denied to Ethel. And what did he become? An engineer. These are bright people, right? And he gets recruited to work at Los Alamos. Los Alamos? Right, the atomic site out there. And David and Julius, and quite possibly Ethel, had long conversations about this strange new project that he was working on. He couldn't say the name of it, but he said, this will change the world. It will end warfare forever. It will save humanity from the death and destruction. In 1943, Julius dropped his membership in the Communist Party, and he ends his subscription to the Daily Worker. You know what the Daily Worker was? Yeah, the communist newspaper, right? Very popular for a while. He sort of felt at that point that he was being threatened by people he knew. He had made contact by this time with the Russian embassy, and he had a handler, a person that he spoke to. What did they know? They knew that both Julius and David Greenwest, the brother-in-law, were closely involved with very important war work in this mysterious place, Los Alamos. I mean, it's the middle of, have you ever been to Los Alamos? It's nowhere, right? It's a National Historic Site. miles, planetary things away, nothing else there, which is why it was chosen. So what are these two highly intelligent guys working on? What is this secret thing that leads them to build this multi-million-dollar project thing, factory, whatever, out in the middle of nowhere? You've all seen Oppenheimer?
Yes.
Okay, so that's basically where they were working, and you saw how barren and everything was. So, Julius asks David, according to the indictment, to give him information about what is called the Manhattan Project, which leads to the development of the atomic bomb. Step back. Why was it called the Manhattan Project? Because the first scientific work on this was done at Columbia University, under the stands at Baker's Field. Baker's Field is the football stadium there, and it was in Manhattan. So you have to give it an anonymous name. You can call it Baker Field because that's sports, people will know that, but you can say the Manhattan Project, which means nothing. So that's why it was called the Manhattan Project. The first science that was done on this, under Baker Field, nobody would ever think to look at it. You don't have stands go all the way up, so you just put a wall right across it, and it's not. People just go right past it. So that's the Manhattan Project. And David Greenglass told Julius that he was working on something called a proximity fuse. Little bit of science, not much. I'm a humanities person. A proximity fuse, as I understand it, is a device that when closes in on something metallic, it goes boom. Very large boom. It's a small object. As far as I understand it, not even maybe as big as this tabletop, depending on how big you want to do it. And it takes a tremendous amount of energy, physics, chemistry, all this kind of stuff to build it. Why? Because it had never been done before. And you needed to invent new machines, new techniques to put the thing together. Okay, so if you understand that, that's all. We're not having a science lesson. Then what happens? In 1945, David turns over handwritten notes and a sketch, a diagram of this proximity fuse lens from the Manhattan Project. If you don't have the lens, you cannot focus the energy needed to make the bomb go boom. Understand the sequence? Okay, good. That took me years to learn. In June 1945, Harry Gold, another name you need to know, a college friend, meets the Greenglasses, Ethel and David, in Albuquerque. And Harry Gold now asks for information. What kind of thing are you working on? I mean, we were best buddies, we shared a lab in college and everything. What's happening in your life? Why are you out here in the middle? In July and August of 1945, the atomic bomb is successfully tested in New Mexico for the first time. A little bit of history there. Building the atomic bomb took billions of dollars, took huge amounts of energy, which is why the Tennessee Valley Authority was built by FDR's New Deal, because that's where you got the energy from, and it took the most incredible minds of people who are infinite geniuses to invent new science to figure this thing out. Now today, you can probably find it online. That's pretty terrible. But in those days, you're inventing, you're pushing the limits of what science is, with one exception, okay? Who knew all about this? Einstein. Because in 1904, he had published 4 incredible papers in physics. And that's why he won the Nobel Prize twice. Einstein's mind was able to grasp things that the rest of us don't. People can know bits and pieces of it and fragments. Oppenheimer could talk to him and understand some of it, but not all of it. But Einstein knew it in the famous equation, energy equals mass squared. It's so simple. It's 1,000 years of physics and chemistry and minds working on this. Hundreds and hundreds of people sitting down in labs doing it. Einstein, by the way, needed a tutor in math because he couldn't do that. But it's boggling the mind that humans could even leap ahead and do this and figure this out. So using Einstein's brand new physics, translated into the practical, how do we build this thing, math, physics, chemistry, engineering, a lot of energy, all this kind of stuff. That's what was going on with the Manhattan Project. When the first atomic bomb was exploded, you all saw Oppenheimer, they didn't know if the world would explode. Right? The whole universe could have died because nobody understood it and what was happening. And at the time, in 1944-45, when they were building this, there were only 3 single digits atomic bombs in the world. It took that long to build them and put them together. So they tested it once, they knew it would work, they shipped the other 2, one they made very big, Fat Boy, the other one they made smaller because by that time they had a little bit better techniques and they called it Thin Man. Because, remember the radio histories and stuff? Thin Man? So that's what and that's it. They were the only 2 existing in the world. And just to step back again to figure out all the history, why didn't we bomb Germany with the atomic bomb? And the answer is because it wasn't ready yet. Germany surrendered when? May 1945, right? The E-Day. But the bomb wasn't tested until June and July, and it wasn't ready. So the only 2 existing bombs were put on an airplane, flown out to Saipan, into the Pacific, put on ships, carriers, the rays, and that's why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. And why did we have to use it twice? Because Japan didn't surrender after the first time. So Hiroshima first, and then Nagasaki August 6th, August 9th, and then that's it. If Japan had not surrendered, we would have had no more atomic bombs. That's it. There were just the 2. And the bombs were carried exclusively, 1 bomb in each of the planes. And why only 1? Because they weighed a ton more. Because it's plutonium, uranium, it's the heavy steel casing. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And in order to make the bomb explode, you used a proximity fuse, which is what David Greenglass and everybody was working on. Are you following any of this?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, what happens? The atomic bomb is successfully tested. And at that point, Julius, 1945, end of the war, is fired from the Signal Corps. The first stable job he's had. Why? Because they discovered, took him this long, his membership in the Communist Party and his subscription to the Daily Worker, which had long since left. He given it up. He tried to get a job after the war at the Emerson Radio Company. Remember Emerson Radio?
Yes.
He was hired, but it was not a good fit. He left, was fired, taken back after a few years, and with David Greenglass, brother-in-law, right, and Harry Gold, City College buddy, right, both members of the Communist Party and also a spy, tried to open a machine shop. He's an engineer, right? He can fix things, he can do things. Didn't work out. In 1946, the Russians agent that he had been assigned to met him for the last time and said, "Thank you very much, goodbye." They don't need him anymore. Why not? I'm so glad you asked. Because the Russians, as the same as we did, had captured German scientists and had transported them to Moscow. And under pain of whatever they were doing, death and said, "And now you work for us." So Werner von Braun, remember him, and the Huntsville rockets, and he didn't care about what he was doing, he wanted the science of it. Von Braun was one of the ones in Germany that had employed Jewish slave labor and others in order to create all this kind of stuff. He was just as guilty, but he wasn't charged. Why not? Because we wanted to be up in space. This is now the new frontier, right? So von Braun lives a happy life along with other German scientists in Huntsville, Alabama, and the German scientists that the Russians captured go to Moscow, and the 2 of them are there. So were their Russian scientists better than German scientists better than ours? Who knows? We both got decided at the same time. So the Russians kiss off Julius and David and say, "We don't need you anymore." At the same time, there is a code, communications back and forth between agents here and in Moscow. It's called Venona, because why? That was the little town where the transmitters were. Now, you all know about electronic stuff. You can pick up your phone and practically call Mars at this point. But in those days, it was kind of scary. It was kind of new and different. So communication was done by code. Not a very difficult code. US broke it long since. But we didn't want to tell the Russians we had broken it because we wanted to know what they were doing. And it was wartime, and they were our allies. So you can sort of, get this together. In 1947, the machine shop business failed. He goes bankrupt. He has no way of support. In 1948, Morton Sobel, another name, but also an electrical engineer for General Electric, had also been at City College, had joined the Communist Party, and turned over documents to the Russians. He meets with Julius, and they exchange microfilms. Microfilms, right? Old technology, microfilms. Sobel will be convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He served 19, and then he was pardoned. In August 1949, the Russians detonated their first atomic bomb. Only 4 years after we built. Extraordinary advances. So how were they able to do it so quickly? 3 reasons. 1, they're German scientists, like Werner Bergman, right? 2, ideas. Science has no borders. You can't, if somebody knows something, it spreads. People know it. Scientists talk to each other. You discover one thing and they have it. And massive state funding. The Russian dictatorship had no need to satisfy Russians to turn war production over to cars and refrigerators and TVs and air conditioning. Remember the way we did civilian economy? We shut down the war production, everything goes into civilian stuff. So they had enormous amounts of funding, and they also had, because of the nature of Russia, huge amounts of electricity power to do it, because they have all the mountains and coal, and they didn't care about civilian uses of this. So, the United States, by this time in 1949, is getting paranoid about the atomic arms race. We don't know what it is, we don't know how far it's going to go, we don't know what could even happen in the world. At the same time, right, we're layering this, January 1950. Remember the name Alger Hiss?
Yeah.
Of course. Hiss had worked at the State Department all through the 1930s, graduate of elite schools. He was convicted of perjury before a congressional committee in denying that he had passed secrets to the communist agent Whittaker Chambers. Remember that name, Chambers Hiss, right? All of that together. Both of them were members of the United States Communist Party. It had nothing to do with the Rosenbergs. They didn't even know each other. But the concept of two spy rings, Hiss, Whittaker, Rosenberg, all kind of blended together. Americans aren't too smart about separating things anyway, and certainly the press didn't help. Blended together that there was this gigantic communist conspiracy that reached up into the highest levels of the State Department, the Congress, the electrical companies. Everything was all kind of linked together. It had nothing to do with them. But it was indicative of the fear of communist spying. This was the case, Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss, that made Nixon a national figure. Nixon was a member of the House Un-American Committees. Remember that? House Un-American? In 1947. Nixon was a prosecuting attorney. He was on board degree. He served in the Navy honorably in World War II. Came back, went into politics. Elected from California. He was a total zero in the House until this case. He seized upon it as part of, did he really believe it, or did he just want whatever it was? He seized upon this case as his ticket to national fame. And he was one of the early ones, McCarthy? Yeah. McCarthy. I have a list of so many guys. This is what he said. He was prosecuting the case as an example of how far the American people had been penetrated by these terrible Russian commie agents that were about to take over the world and destroy it with atomic energy. I mean, it sounds almost ludicrous now, but, cast your mind back at the time. That's what it was. Nixon became a national figure as a result of the Hiss-Whittaker case. And because of that case, the American public got fixated on commie spies all over the nation doing it anyway. It was that case that led Eisenhower to pick him in 1952 as vice president. It reinforced, when Nixon started talking about this, it reinforced Nixon's anti-Semitism. Because in going into the case, Chambers, Hiss, and the others, it turned out that a lot of the people in the science field were Jews, because that's what Jews do. Right? They were there. Nixon's comment, which was Polish at the time, all these goddamn Jews are communists. And that, again, sets the stage for what's going to happen with the Rosenbergs. In February 1950, a man called Klaus Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, in Great Britain, is unmasked as a Russian spy in the British scientific circles. He was a naturalized German who worked at Los Alamos as part of the scientific exchange. Britain was an ally, and he was there. And he also passed secrets to the Russians. That implicated the Rosenbergs, who got tarred, who got tangled into this. There is almost, they were at the same place together. Did they know each other? In passing, I mean, it was a small area, and they certainly worked on the same thing. But did they ever both do the same thing? Probably not. In any case, Klaus Fuchs is arrested, he's jailed, he's released after 9 years. He goes to work in East Germany, where he continues to work on atomic energy. He died in 1988. In March 1950, events are moving quickly now, Julius warns David Greenglass to leave the United States. Why? Because Greenglass was the one that worked at Los Alamos, and he was the one that was intimately involved in this. When Greenglass is finally tried, he will be sentenced, I'll tell you why in a minute, to 15 years. He served only 9 before he was released. In May 1950, March, April, May, Julius goes to a doctor, his local doctor, and he asks about preventive medical shots before he goes to Mexico. What should he get? He also tries to update his passport. Harry Gold is taken into custody and confesses to the FBI and says, I only did it because of the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses. Turning state's evidence. He names Julius as the person, Harry Gold names Julius, as the person who recruited him to supply information to the Soviet Union. Julius, the same month, June 1950, is interviewed by the FBI. And what else happens in 1950 that shatters the United States? The start of the Korean War. The same time that the Greenglasses and Rosenbergs and everybody, all this atomic spy stuff is bubbling up. North Korea, remember, invades the South? And China comes to help them. China has, 1949, become a communist country, so now you have the 2 biggest countries in the world, Russia, China, Korean War. We just got out of World War II 5 years ago. So all of this is bubble, bubble, bubble. It's all there. In July 1950, Julius is arrested and sent to jail. In August 1950, the month after that, Ethel is arrested. The Sobel family, Morton Sobel, are kidnapped in Mexico and turned over to the United States at the Texas border. Is that legal? Can you kidnap American citizens abroad? Ship them in? In January 1951, a grand jury indicts the Rosenbergs, Sobels, Greenglasses as Russian agents. February 1951, David Greenglass makes a deal with the prosecutors. He changes his story, and he says that Ethel, his sister, was the one who typed up the notes that Julius passed to the Russian agents. Did that happen? March 6, 1951. The Rosenberg trial begins. It ends on March 23. 3 weeks. For one of the most important espionage trials in U.S. history. The verdict was foregone. They were convicted, quote, conspiracy to commit espionage. That's fascinating. Everybody says, conspiracy, what does that mean? Because the act that they were convicted on was the 1917 Espionage Act. They weren't convicted of actually turning over something. They were convicted of conspiracy to do something. Why? Because the federal government had no proof. They didn't have the other end of it. Yeah, he knew all this stuff. So what they charged him with was conspiracy. And under the 1917 Espionage Act, the penalty is death, of course. In 1951, when they're scheduled for sentencing, Judge Kaufman, the Jewish judge, imposes the death sentences on Julius and Ethel, but he sentences Martin Sobel to 30 years. Sobel will serve 19 and then be released. In 1952, the lawyers for the Rosenbergs appealed to the Second Circuit Court. The circuit courts are just below the Supreme Court. Denied. In 1953, in June, it goes to the Supreme Court for review. The Supreme Court in 1953 denies the appeal on the grounds that everything was okay, and also a stay of execution while further legal avenues are explored. For example, like, does the Espionage Act apply to all of this? There's all kinds of legal issues here. The Rosenbergs appeal, again, their lawyer appeals. June 17, following this, very quick, 1953. Justice William O. Douglas stays a execution, grants a stay of execution. He says there are serious legal issues involved in this. Kidnapping, the legality of what they were charged under, what proof do they have? All of this, right account, a 3 weeks trial and then the death penalty. So William O. Douglas issues a stay of execution until all these legal issues can be resolved. June, 2 days later, 1953. The Supreme Court meets in a special en banc session. En banc is just, all together, all 9 of them. And they vacate Douglas's stay of execution. June 19, 1953. Julius and Ethel are executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York State. The use of the electric chair is still legal, and they are both executed on the same day. His first and then her. She wrote a last letter to her sons, and with your permission, I will just quote from it. Dearest sweethearts, my most precious children, only this morning it looked like we might be together again after all. Now that this cannot be, I want so much for you to know that I have come also to realize. Unfortunately, I may only write a few simple words. The rest, your own lives must teach you, even as mine taught mine. At first, of course, you will grieve bitterly for us, but you will not grieve alone. That is our consolation, that it must eventually be yours. You must come to believe that life is worth living. Be comforted that even now, with the end of our life slowly approaching, we know this with the conviction that defeats the executioner. Your lives must teach you too that good cannot flourish in the midst of evil, that freedom and all the things that go to make up a truly satisfying and worthwhile life must sometimes be purchased very dearly. Be comforted then that we were serene and understand with the deepest kind of understanding that civilization has not as yet progressed to the point where life does not have to be lost for the sake of evil. And that we were comforted in the sure knowledge that others would carry on after us. We wish we might have had the tremendous joy and gratification of living our lives out with you. Your daddy, who was with me, that's not true. They were kept separated, but she put that in the boys. Your daddy, who was with me in the last momentous hours, sends his heart and all the love that is in it for his dearest boys. Always remember that we were innocent and could not wrong our consciences. We press you close and kiss you with all our strength Lovingly, Daddy and Mommy. That was what she wrote. They are buried in Pine Lawn Cemetery in New York City. Plain white headstones.
Where are they buried?
Pine Lawn Cemetery in New York City. You can go in and see it. It's just plain white marble headstones. Their names and death and birth. Nothing about anything else. In 1960, do you remember that the USSR shot down Gary Powers and used the spy planes? You know how they got him? The proximity fuse.
Oh.
How did they die?
They were able to shoot him down because the proximity fuse that had been developed for the atomic bomb worked. They fired the missile, the fuse comes close to the airplane, and it blew off his tail and wings. He parachuted out. And that became a huge event in Eisenhower's presidency. In 1969, Martin Sobel was released from prison. Never apologized. In 1970, 74, Khrushchev, remember Khrushchev?
Sure.
He tapes his memoirs, doesn't write them. He tapes his memoirs and they're released to the United States in English in 1990. His memoirs suggest, but do not provide evidence, that the Rosenbergs helped the Soviet Union obtain the atomic bomb. Was he telling the truth? No idea. But that's part of his going back, justifying saying what he did. In 1995, the decoded cables, remember I told you they had broken the Russian code, were finally released by the National Security Administration and the CIA that said, if you read them carefully, it implicated the Rosenbergs' involvement in this espionage, that they actually did. Okay, so you have Khrushchev, you have the code cables, you have confessions of people doing it. In 2001, David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, admits that his trial testimony implicating Ethel was a lie.
Oh.
She did not type up the notes that he got. He perjured himself. Why? To save his wife. His wife was Ruth. Ruth was the one who transcribed the diagrams, the notes, all the scientific type stuff from David that was passed on to the Soviets by Julius. Ethel never typed out David's notes. Ruth never went to jail. David was never prosecuted for perjury. There was never a reopening of the case based on perjured testimony that was admitted by the person who did it. And so, we are left with questions. Did Ethel know what Julius was doing? It is inconceivable to me that she did not. Does it matter? Why didn't they get life sentences instead of death? Very interesting ethical question. Very philosophical question. Why did they have to be put to death? Having read extensively on the sentencing procedures, it is fascinating to me. And mind you, we do not execute women in this country. Lots of other people, but rarely women. Okay? Both of them had to be killed, according to what I read. Both of them had to be killed to demonstrate that the United States would punish anyone that helped the evil commies. And more importantly, because they were Jews as part of it. Because you couldn't trust them, right? That's Nixon. You couldn't trust them because they were all commies. They were out to undermine the system. In 2008, Martin Sobel admitted that he did spy for the USSR, that Ethel had nothing to do with it, and that it was Julius that he just passed information on. So, talk about the boys for a minute. Remember I told you they had two sons. They were 6 and 9 years old when their parents were executed. 6 and 9. They were first placed together with each living grandmother. One year they went to one living grandmother, and the next year they went to the other. That was not acceptable because it was an impractical thing. They spent a year in Tom's River with friends of their parents that they had known from City College. That also did not prove terribly useful. They were finally formally adopted, not just placed with, but adopted by Abel and Anne Meeropol. And as part of the adoptions, their last names were changed from Rosenberg to Meeropol because it was toxic at that point, and that was part of what the court ordered. Now, what do you know about Abel Meeropol? You should. He is a lyricist and a composer of the song Strange Fruit in 1939 about the lynching of blacks. Scottsboro Boys, right? Sung by, among others, and I would urge you to find this someplace on the internet, I'm sure, Nina Simone and Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday's is the version I like best. So Strange Fruit, the black bodies hanging from trees, Scottsboro, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It just goes back and forth. Robert and Michael, when they became adults, wrote a book about themselves, a sort of biography, and their parents' lives. It's called We Are Your Sons, The Legacy of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. It was published in 1975. I'm sure you can find it and read it for yourself. Their sons have accepted the possibility that their father, Julius, had been involved in spying for the Soviet Union during the Second World War. However, they point out in the book, Justification, that at the time, the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. The central I'm quoting from the book. The central lesson of this episode is that our government abused its power in dangerous ways that remain relevant today. Those in power targeted our parents, making them the focus of the public's Cold War era, fear, anger, and prejudice. They manufactured testimony and evidence. They arrested our mother simply as leverage to get our father to cooperate. They used the ultimate weapon, the threat of death, to try to extort a confession. They created the myth that there was a key secret ingredient of the atomic bomb, and then devised a strategy based on lies to make it appear that our father had sought and passed on that secret. They executed our father when he refused to collaborate in this lie. They executed our mother as well, even though they knew that she was not an active participant in any espionage activities. End quote. And so, what are we to make of this trial today? Could something like this happen again? Why has no person of authority, in or out of the government, sought to revisit this trial and verdict and correct it? Was gender and anti-Semitism an issue? As we assume. And how did the American public react to this? They cheered on the night of the execution. Yay! The commies, they're dead. It was dirty, and on and on and on, right? I compare this in a slightly different way. You know the name Jonathan Pollard?
Yes.
He was convicted in 1987 of passing U.S. secrets to Israel, an ally. He was sentenced to life in prison. Right? Not death, but life in prison. Every president, until 2015, refused to pardon him, although many efforts were made. He was finally pardoned in 2015 on the condition that he leave the United States permanently. He is now in Israel, where he has citizenship, and he lives there now. So, Jonathan Pollard, the Rosenbergs, David Greengrass, Martin Sullivan, communism, Korean War, atomic energy. That's scary even now. There have been nuclear treaties, many of them abrogated. New nuclear states, North Korea, Iran, China for sure, have no guardrails on what they will or will not do. And so this threat, this overhanging black cloud, remember Lou Abner?
Yes, sure.
This black cloud of the extinction of our lives, of our world, still hangs over us, decades after the end of World War II. And it all gets traced back to the Rosenberg case. That's when it first exploded, literally. This is making a pun, bad pun. And focusing people's minds on the possibility that Americans, born and educated here, could do something to help an enemy. It just, there are so many layers of this. It's hard to untangle them all, and hard to figure out what's the most important. I submit to you a couple of things. Irrational fear. People just listen to crazy things. People do that without finding out the truth. Certainly, gender-related. Little Ethel Rosenberg, you suspect those people. Anti-Semitism without question. Without question. Nixon publicly stated those Jews, damn commies. The enemies in the world around us. Russia hasn't changed. China hasn't changed. Now we had North Korea, Iran, a couple of the others. It's a scary world that we live in. And the Rosenberg case was part of the beginning of that. And there's also an element of racism also, going back to when they stood up for the Scottsboro boys and transferring later. So there's a whole bunch of things about this. There are lots of books written about it. I read the Rosenberg, the Muirpole sons. Read their own account. See how you feel about that. Find some place to listen to Strange Fruit. That was their adopted father. And listen to that, because that's also part of the fear of the other and how things do or do not work out. It's extraordinary that something of this sort, how many years ago? Today, I submit, is still a powerful event, message, whatever. Thank you for your attention.
Susan, I was always interested in this case to find out who the attorneys were who tried this case, because when I researched that, it was very telling. And here's the way it lined up. On the government side, the chief prosecutor in this case was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. His name was Irving Sapol. He was a career prosecutor with extensive experience in criminal law. And he had an assistant, a young attorney, hadn't been practicing that long, but was very well connected. And he assisted in the trial of the case, and he went on to a very interesting career. His name was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn later became the chief counsel for Senator McCarthy, and went on to a somewhat infamous career as a New York fixer and New York attorney.
One of his early clients, of course, was Trump.
And then, of course, they also had a large staff of assistants working on this case. The Rosenbergs, on the other side, their attorney was an attorney from New York named Emanuel Block. Okay, by the way, Mr. Sapol, Mr. Cohn, both Jewish lawyers,
Yes,
okay?
that's what's Roy Cohn.
And Emanuel Block was an attorney in New York who had virtually no criminal experience at all. He specialized in the sale of bakeries. Seriously.
Commercial lawyer.
Right. That was his expertise. If this happened today, it never would happen today, because the Rosenbergs, who had no money to pay somebody, would be represented by an experienced
Right.
defense counsel. But if you notice, the judge was Judge Kaufman, Jewish judge. The prosecution side, Sapol and Cohn, Jewish attorneys, and on the defense side, Emmanuel Block, who was a fine man, he was a decent attorney, had no concept of how
Way
to
over
try
his
this
head.
case.
Yes.
So, you know, when you look at that, you say, I ask myself, would there have been a different result if there had been proper representation?
Like Clarence Darrow.
Yeah, I have a tendency not to think so, because the whole atmosphere at the time was to convict communist spies.
And sentence them to
Right,
death.
yeah. I think the real tragedy is the Ethel Rosenberg
Yeah.
part of it.
And the effect also, it's interesting to me, I hope you got some of the chronology, I know I went fast. 3 weeks for this trial.
Yeah.
Started in early March, ended in the end of March, that's it.
Yeah, if it was today, it would be 3 months.
I mean, it goes on for years now, so was the fix in? Who knows?
Why would the brother say it was his sister? Why didn't he say it was his brother-in-law? Why would he say his
He
sister?
turned in,
He didn't want his wife.
he didn't want his wife to be convicted. Ruth Goldberg, Ruth Greengrass, David's wife, was the one who actually physically copied, years later, when we have all the documents, it's her handwriting.
Oh.
She copied them all out. She was the one that copied the neat diagrams and all the formulas and whatever else it was, turned them over to David and Julius, and they were the ones that gave them to the Russians. He turned on Ethel to protect Ruth. He betrayed his sister, and he admitted he had lied.
Yeah.
He committed perjury.
He was on 60 Minutes, he was interviewed on 60 Minutes
And they never
several
put him-
years ago by Mike Wallace. And that man showed no remorse whatsoever. I remember watching it, and I couldn't believe it, the
Right.
things that he was saying. And Mike Wallace said, why did you do this? And he said, I wanted to live, and I did not want to go to prison.
And I wanted to save my wife.
Right.
And it was never reopened. He's admitting it.
You know, in this day, that never would have happened. They would have gotten jail time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they would have been out.
I agree.
Assuming somebody prosecuted.
I totally agree with you.
Right. That would never would have happened.
We don't execute spies anymore.
We sent them some. Yes.
But anyways, Ruth never had a code name.
No.
Ethel, I'm sorry.
Ethel, no.
And the others did.
Yes.
That was another example.
Yes, and when they were prosecuted, the prosecution kept saying, the reason that the stuff was turned over and was so valuable was because Ethel typed it. Remember, Ethel was a clerk and she knew it. The notes were not typed. When you look back at the documents, they're handwritten in Ruth's handwriting, not Ethel's. The case to this day has never been reopened. It's too embarrassing. So, I'm grateful for the opportunity, as always. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.